And we're live. Hi, I'm Dazza Greenwood, a scientist at MIT Media Lab. And this is a presentation and discussion that I'm doing with friend and colleague Beth McCarthy at her regular Tuesday mechanism design working group in San Francisco. And here's everybody in the group. Hi, everybody, and hi, Beth.
Hi.
Great. So tonight, Beth and I thought it would be interesting to talk about this type of system that I've worked on over the years, many years now, in more of like a web world, because there might be some things that we could learn from it that could be extrapolated and maybe reused with some evolution in a blockchain space or in other more modern and emerging spaces in technology where questions of governance and sort of overarching rules are needed. So we're calling it multipolar interlateral networked governance. And so the first word there, multipolar, kind of speaks to the type of network system where there's a bunch of stakeholders or people that basically can't fire each other. So it's not a single hierarchical system or a centralized system in the sense that there's like a fiefdom or a single authority in charge. So this would be different in that way from say a Facebook or a payment system or a government system, or almost most systems that we think of have a kind of a hierarchical ownership and control to it. But some systems actually are multilateral. There's some treaty organizations in the public sector that are that way. You could think of the United Nations as being something like that. There's lots of trade consortia too, or supply chain sometimes. There's one kind of supply chain where there's one big supplier at the top of it and a lot of folks that they sell to, or there's a big buyer at the top of it, like a Ford Motor Company or Boeing, and a lot of suppliers that go up to them. But some of them actually have a lot of big buyers and a lot of big sellers, and they're in more of like a network. So the idea of multipolar is getting at where there's not just one or two, but there's several big players that all have to agree voluntarily on how they're going to connect and operate together. So that's the first word, multipolar. The second word is a little bit strange. It's interlateral. And that's a word I just made up. And what it's supposed to mean is, in the contracts. So you could say the multipolar kind of speaks to the business, kind of realpolitik of, how many power players are there and how is that all distributed. The second word, interlateral, speaks more to the legal dimension. And so in the law, when you've got two parties agreeing to something by contract or even by an international agreement, we would call that bilateral. If you've got a multi-party agreement, I sort of mentioned this earlier, you might call it multilateral. That's sometimes used. That's in a multi-party contract, we would probably just call it multi-party contract or something. Multilateral is more of like when you have sovereigns involved. But the idea of interlateral is that there's a bunch of players, and the system describes interactions that are ongoing in an operations layer. So just like we have like internet, for example, you can also structure rules at a high level so that they allow for like many to many and even like emergent interactions. So that's what interlateral is trying to get at there. You'll see more what I mean when I show some examples. And then the last word is network, and that kind of speaks to the technology a little bit more, and that just means that we've connected the endpoints, like the systems and the services, the nodes, if you will, in a network, so that there's a sense of continuous connection. So a blockchain is networked in a sense. Certainly anything on the web is networked. Anything within a local area network or a wide area network and an organization's networked. So network just really speaks to the connectivity that's continuous and online and digital. Okay, so before I kind of go any further, can you help me ask it if there's any kind of questions or, clarifications on just that scope of the talk, because I know that's sort of a.
Yeah, I think it would be really good to kind of ground in how each of those relates to blockchain, like maybe even go back through, each of those words and say, okay, now that we have an understanding of where this concept comes from in a general sense, how it relates specifically to kind of the possibility space that we're looking at in blockchain. First, specifically when you were talking about like sovereigns, for example, it's like interesting to think of, if that originally applied to kind of sovereign states that are all able to kind of like act autonomously in this network to figure out, incentive compatible ways forward for, pushing like laws or standards, like what could that mean in a system of sovereigns, figuring out how to govern itself, such as, a DAO or, these other kind of blockchain systems that we're creating. So, and yeah, just, to kind of have a grounding of, how governance in terms of, governments and parties that, are able to act autonomously from a legal perspective, then flows into a, term of governance that's both kind of a metaphor and kind of an abstraction, but also a very, has a very specific meaning. So.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot there. So I think in general, what I'd like to do in terms of connecting it to the blockchain is first just show 3 kind of examples of how this stuff has been done in the past. And then once you've kind of seen those 3 examples, then I want to extrapolate to, well, first of all, just see if there's any questions about it, make sure everyone understands it, and then extrapolate to sort of best of these systems that could perhaps be used in something like a DAO or another distributed type of system on a blockchain. I think that would be the best order. There's one little distinction I'd make from the way you said it. With the sovereigns, it's not so much about them acting autonomously. They have no problem acting autonomously. This is an example of a framework that has been honed over, well, centuries in a sense, but certainly decades, so that they can act collectively, despite the fact that they are sovereign and have the right to act autonomously and on their own prerogative and do whatever they want. It's sometimes in their interest to agree voluntarily to have a kind of a set of expected behaviors and interactions that actually limit, in some sense, their sovereignty based on their agreement, because they find it's in their interest to act collectively sometimes.
Totally.
One clarifying question. So this fundamental or the multipolar interlateral governance, does that describe any governance system that operates within the context that you described, or is this a very specific framework for governing in those contexts?
So what are the 2 options?
So does any governance system which operates in the context that you defined fall into the bucket of multipolar interlateral governance, or are you presenting a very specific framework that you feel is well adapted to those contexts?
So unfortunately, it's the curse of these kind of consumer grade technologies. But you blurred out the word that was most important, which was what that context was you were describing. So I get the distinction. I'm sorry. Thanks for passing me.
Yeah, no worries. Can you hear me better from here?
Way better. I can hear every word now. It's a dream.
Perfect. So yeah, my question was the context that you described, the multipolar interlateral governance. Would any governance system that is used within the context you described fit into that bucket, or are you presenting a specific framework that you feel is well suited to those contexts?
I got you. Okay, thanks. Boy, it sure is handy hearing every word. Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. Could you put me back?
Yeah.
I bet this is what it's like if you upload your consciousness to like a brick or something, people have to take you places. Anyway, okay, now I'm back here. The answer is, yeah, this is very much tuned to a specific subset of situations or contexts where this combination of attributes for governance seems to be handy. The most typical kind of governance that I've set up in my career has basically had not either of the first 2 attributes. It's not kind of multipolar, it's singular, and it's not interlateral. It's more like unilateral, and basically they're like bylaws or rules governing a hierarchical system. So most of what I'm talking about here would be totally inappropriate and overkill for that kind of thing. But when you start getting a bunch of different parties together that kind of can't fire each other or cannot order each other around, it ups the ante a little bit. It requires a little more sophistication for coming up with an umbrella set of rules and the governance of those rules and technical architectures and business practices and everything. And so what I'm going to show you is a method of addressing those. So let me actually just spend the next few minutes and just show you some examples, and then let's talk a lot with the examples in mind. And definitely, I'd be very interested to join you in a brainstorm about if there's any things here that we could learn that could be useful in this kind of very next generation enterprise of coming up with distributed autonomous organizations and entities with a blockchain. So I'm going to do a little screen share here. Am I sharing?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So here's just a blog page I set up for tonight with some links. Okay, here's a good example of like a very common set of rules. And I participated back in the 1990s with this group. It's called NACHA, National Automated Clearinghouse Association. So they ACH payments are a big part of how money gets moved from banks to bank. And this is the organization that comes up with the rules for that. But it turns out that they have a number of councils that come up with rules for different types of payment networks. One of them that I've worked on is called EBT, Electronic Benefit Transfer. This is an example of the rules for that. Just at the high level, you can sort of see there's always some definitions, which is a whole thing coming up with single definitions across different players and contexts. And now notice here, first of all, the type of system this is sort of like a credit card system, but the card holders are actually welfare recipients. And the idea here was to move away from paper food stamps for welfare benefits, because paper is so gross and fraud prone and fragile. People lose it. Getting it onto a card, we thought would make it more efficient and also a little bit less stigma when it came time to pay at the point of sale. They just use a card like anybody else. And we felt that there'd be big savings and it would be better. In fact, over the decades, it has been shown to be much better. So one of the things in any card holder kind of payment system, in most like specifically credit cards, but also these debit type cards, is that you have banks are one stakeholder group. There's two kinds of banks, the issuing bank and the acquiring bank. The issuing bank kind of issues the cards, and the acquiring bank kind of works with the merchant and they kind of receive the money. And then I kind of gave it away, but you have merchants that are at point of sale that kind of receive payments. And you have card holders. And in Visa operating rules and MasterCard and others, they have more systems. They have more sections on the card holders and the card holder agreements. With the welfare, it's kind of just already so heavily regulated, they didn't need to treat it in the rules here. Now, other kinds of things you have in here are, here's a good one, liability and indemnification. So in these multilateral types of arrangements, especially the voluntary private sector ones, that liability, one of the reasons for doing is to figure out what everyone's risk is and to try to contain and manage the risk. Another thing is breaking into knowing what role you play in the network and what your rights and obligations are with respect to every other role in the network is another reason why we kind of write it down and negotiate it. So there's roles and relationships, and they're specified. And then the type of transactions they're doing here, error resolution, settlement, and reconciliation are big processes that the network deals with, and they have guidelines and standards and rules for that. Security is always a big thing here. And then another thing is people want to know who's in the club and who's not in the club. So there's usually some kind of trademark or service mark or some kind of logo that will let you know if you're like in the Visa club, or if you're in a certain supply chain, or in a some network or consortium or federation. And that's an easy way to know who's in and who's out. And the fact that it can be trademarked also means, if people start using that mark, but they're not really in the club, like maybe they're a fraud artist or they're trying to mislead people or they've been kicked out recently, you can stop people from using the mark because it's basically a violation of trademark if they're not approved to use the mark. So trademark is another interesting characteristic of basically all these groups. Miscellaneous was just due to sloppy, drafting. And then you also see agreements. So the way that people, you might wonder, like, how do these overarching rules, how do they apply to anybody that's in the group? Like, how are they enforceable? Well, they're enforceable by contract, just private people agreeing with other private people. And the basic feature of the participation agreements for any party playing any role in the system is that they say we agree to abide by the rules of the system. Like, that's the main thing that they do. So let's take a look at one or two of these as an example, and then I'll just skip over to a couple of others.
Wait, this could be a good time to stop and ask questions, because I know that
okay, hold on.
There's a lot of different parts here, kind of starting with the fact of, the importance of operational definitions. I kind of divided what you said into kind of sections of first set out operational definitions of like who the actors are, who they are in relation to each other. And from that, you're able to say, these are the different points that make up the system. And then you need, marks to come in and say, marks as in like trademarks to be, to have a function of saying, okay, these are the, kind of assets or products or like, materials related to the system or entities. And, because it's been very clearly defined who is able to, access or use or attribute what in which ways, then the marks enable these kind of, use cases to be like enforced and directed. So then it's almost like an operational definition of like actions.
Sort of. Is a little blurry at the end of your mark, but everything else you said, I think, was exactly what I was saying. A couple of notable things that you didn't mention, which I can't stress enough, is in the business part, it's like, well, who's in and who's out, and how do you get in? And how do you get in as a certain role? So like there's certain things you can't just declare yourself a minor, for example. Like you'd need to download a node and have some computational power. Like there's things you literally have to do to be a minor. In the case of these more kind of lockdown networks, some of those things include sign an agreement and have a certain amount of insurance or other types of things. So like who's in and who's out is a major one for business rules, and I can show you the subset of that is the process for onboarding usually involves some kind of process and some way to get into a registry or directory, and then the process for offboarding. So one of the great things about looking at systems that have been functioning for decades is they've worked out a lot of things and regularized it, and kind of the water's flown over the rocks, so there's no sharp edges. So offboarding is like voluntary. If you decide I don't feel like being in this anymore, or we're lose my entity's getting out of that line of business, there's like you kind of give a notice and you tie up your affairs and then you're taken off the list. And then there's involuntary termination. Like, oh wow, like you're plaguing everybody and you've been like the source of a lot of fraud and problems, and we've gone through arbitration 3 times with you, and there's some criteria at which people can no longer be in the club anymore. And that's a core part of a voluntary organization to be able to keep functioning, is to know what are the minimum expectations to remain in. So who's in and who's out major on the business level. On the legal level is the next big bucket of things. Liability is like 90% of what is argued about, and 90% of the rules are parsing liability and damages. And the technology, it's really security and standards and procedures for interoperability and what kind of data do you have to gather, and what services are supported, that kind of stuff. So those are some of the major features. Now let me show you one that I think is a little better because I wrote it. So you might have noticed I just kind of put things into a few categories. Here we go. And the categories I found, having done a few of these things, it seemed like everything kind of fit into business stuff, technical stuff like card specifications, security stuff's almost all technical, and legal stuff, liability, arbitration, dispute resolution, whatever. So here's an example of another organization. This is called ID Federation. And for the last maybe 15 years or so, whenever I write up these rule sets for these, you know, multilateral organizations that are in some transactional system. I always break them into business stuff, legal stuff, and technology stuff. And that seems to have worked really well. So here's the trust framework is the overarching rules for this identity federation in the insurance space. And then there's the participation agreements. Let's take a look at the trust framework. Here's the most current one. So one thing I'll say is that the insurance industry was very classy, and they were very good. They were very, I appreciate that they let us publish this one under a Creative Commons license, so that in, you know, moments like today, it can be shared. So some mission statement is best practice at the top, like just what is this about? Like this, the equivalent might be this DAO is to allow, you know, people to pool their assets and, you know, figure out what they want to invest it in, or this is to, you know, make it easy to digitally sign things, or time stamping. Just basically whatever it is, it's helpful to make sure everyone's exactly on the same page for what the scope of the thing is. Then there's a bunch of business stuff, like more detailed scope. And then I literally just separate all the roles out right at the top. So in this one, it's identity providers, relying parties, people you can sign in with, policy authorities. There's federation operator, which would be the equivalent of people like miners and like whoever the core developers are. Assessors are people who go around, if something has to be certified, who's qualified to certify that it meets a standard. In this case, you know, when there's an official communication of some type, or when, you know, there's a notice or an alert that's official, not just email or a, you know, something kind of whimsical in a GitHub issue. You know, there's a, you know, you want to distinguish those. Where do you find all the policies? Who's eligible to be in? How do you stay in? 103, continued compliance. And how do you get out? You can be terminated voluntarily or involuntarily. And then you get some warnings is typical. You know, audit, you could be suspended in this case because they wanted to give people a chance to get back in without too much service disruption. Training, there's training requirements, and how do you use the trust mark? Now here's a bunch of legal stuff. We just put all the legal stuff in this section of the same document so everyone can see all the business, legal, and technical stuff, no matter whether they're business people, legal people, or technical people. We found that made everything work much better. I found that many times. So legal stuff, liability, like I promised, is the first thing. And there's some interesting stuff there if people want to drill down into it. If you start getting enough of an industry doing something, that's really good feeling, but it also has some bad stuff that can happen. So sometimes you need an antitrust policy in there. So we had one in this case. People usually like to obsess over who owns things, so something on intellectual property. Dispute resolution is huge. One of the best things about having people agree on how they're going to behave up front is you can keep disputes inside of the system. And you know, there's no need to go to court when this is done very, very well, or there's rarely a need. So we have sort of a system here for mediation, and that doesn't work, go to arbitration. In this case, we just identified the American Arbitration Association's rules. They have a subset of rules for commercial arbitration, and we just kind of set that, and not much is confidential. I'll skip over some of this stuff, but the only other thing I want to say legally is order of precedence. So a lot of times you're dealing with parties that are not just using your system to do things with each other. They may have other contracts and other business relationships. So a big question can be like, you know, you have to understand that whatever DAO you have or whatever network you have is not the only thing that governs these people's relationships. So sometimes you need to indicate if they've got other contracts, maybe those don't apply when they're doing this thing, or if they have some other big contract between themselves where, you know, they split liability evenly, well, maybe that's between those parties going to be the thing that governs. And if it conflicts with the liability of your little network, then, you know, their previous agreement, maybe they want to govern. So being real clear about the order of precedence of what rules apply, especially with a bunch of parties that have a bunch of relationships, is very good idea to do. An amendment. So, you know, it's foreseeable that you're not going to come up with a be-all, end-all rules on day one. And this system here has actually been amended 4 times over the last 10 years. They only have the most recent couple up there. But, you know, technology changes, the types of transactions and use cases they want to cover change, stuff changes, and there needs to be a way to amend the rules by consent. And then here's my favorite part, all the technical stuff. This is the fun stuff. And so usually when I do these things, I just start right up with the use cases, like what use cases are we covering? And how do you get new use cases on in the future on board, like on a roadmap, and how do you retire use cases that we don't want anymore? And so we have an appendix for all that. And then here are the standards that we're applying. In this case, oh, there's an, excuse the interruption, is there any chance to set what? Wait, let me read Telegram here. I just got a notice, but then it disappeared. To set the live stream on your screen share. What does that mean? Oh, is it not sharing?
Oh, no.
Oh, here we go. Okay, it's sharing now. Thank you, whoever said that out in internet land. You can go back and see everything I just said by scrolling through idfederation.org. And from here on out, I've now set the right camera for the live stream. Sorry about that. And isn't Telegram great? You're welcome, David Hamill. Okay, so standards. So in this case, we're just using a few standards. Security assertion markup language was the big one. So what subset of that standard are we applying in this case? Call that a profile of the standard. You know, which attributes and what fields are we setting and how, just to make sure everything's interoperable. We kind of write all that down. The big thing here is to get into the network technically, we have to do a metadata exchange for all the players. And that's how we onboard them onto the network and make sure everything's routed correctly and everything's discoverable and we're auditing, making the right stuff kind of operate correctly and that we can audit it later. Time sync can be big. We're use Stratum 3 here, which is, you know, pretty fast, but not, you know, like military grade fast, not even TV grade fast, but pretty fast for a network and for these transactions. Some stuff on usernames and passwords, the equivalent would be, you know, key management on a blockchain and wallet stuff. Delegation, logging and monitoring is big with these people. Security is humongous in the industry. And then the technology people really were awesome. And part of what they did was come up with this little table. They wanted to know, well, for any given role, like what are the specific things we have to do? So just at a glance, our staff can know what we're doing. So we put that in there. And here's the appendices. Well, I'll just scroll down. Here's a certificate policy because we're building on top of a public key infrastructure a little bit there. Here's what you can and can't do with a trademark. Basically, when you're in, you can put it on your page and put it on your service. When you're out, you have to take it off. Antitrust policy is if you're very successful, you'll be lucky enough to have to worry about that. Intellectual property rights, basically, most of this stuff was not proprietary. Amendments and change management, really important. I can talk about that later, but basically all the key stakeholder groups, in this case, it was insurance carriers like the Hartford, like Liberty Mutual, I think, Progressive Insurance, and some of that's one group. Another group was brokers, agents, vendors. So all of those are the kind of major stakeholder groups, or the poles, if you will, in this federation. And they all got to decide for themselves. They could kind of put people on this board of directors to make sure they all had representation. And then when it was time to change the rules, then those are the people that you could bring it up to, and then they on their next meeting agenda say we want to update to a new version of SAML or change something or other, and then they create a new version of the overall rules. So one thing I want to say about that, actually, let me just get back here. So there's an example of a federation that's used in the insurance industry, and the most important thing about these overarching rules when they're voluntary is that you in the participation agreement, you want to let people be able to voluntarily leave the federation before new rules for a future version of the thing become binding. So you can argue in the group, you know, do we want to, you know, fork this, or do you want to upgrade that, or support some new service or standard? And then maybe you win and maybe you lose. But when the sunrise of a change for the overarching rules is going to happen, needs to be more time than the amount of time for people to just easily voluntarily get out of the system. Now, so some systems, like the ones that I've worked on, it doesn't make sense for people to pull out, you know, in 5 minutes notice, because you have to finish like reconciliation and settlement and untangling them from all the systems and have them not show up on things. So usually it's like weeks or months even to wind down participation. So if people have 3 months, for example, to voluntarily opt out of this insurance federation, then maybe a new rule can't go into effect any sooner than like 5 months. So that if you can't live with the next set of rules, you can leave. That's a core set of the basic deal for a voluntary overarching system like this. So that's a second. I've got one more example I want to show you, but maybe we can pause again and see if there's any questions or comments on what I just said.
I have a question on that subject. The ID systems that I'm familiar with, mostly TrueSonar, which is not blockchain based at all, Sovereign, which has a permission network on the blockchain, and Civic, which is permissionless. And so what I was wondering, of those three types of ID management system, are you envisaging, like how much of those are you envisaging transferring what is currently done by human beings and organizations into smart contracts? And does, the aspects of the system that can be represented in smart contracts vary greatly between different types of ID systems? For example, Civic versus Sovereign. Now, I'd be very interested to hear, what your comments would be on those existing blockchain-based ID systems. Are their fundamental characteristics significantly different from what you've just described, and it's just an implementational difference, or are we really looking at different functional behavior with those smart contracts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the only one of those systems that you mentioned that I'm really familiar with is Sovereign and the Sovereign Foundation. And I'm very vaguely familiar with the others. I could take a look and speak more, in a more informed way about them. But just to at least address Sovereign, they are an example of a kind of very overarching, kind of multilateral, voluntary organization that does exactly what I'm talking about. And I'd say they're actually best practice when it comes to rules. They have business, legal, and technical sections of their overarching rules and participation agreements, and it's very sophisticated the way they do it. The question, so in terms of what the rules are that govern that kind of network, I'd say they're really good examples of what I consider best practice, and I didn't have anything to do with those, but I really admire them. However, you'll notice that I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but to my knowledge, I think they're all pretty much instantiated in narrative, like human readable text documents. And the smart contracts that they have in the Sovereign Foundation, to my knowledge at least, they haven't translated yet. And I'm not aware of any of these federations or consortia that have yet translated these rules into purely machine readable code. And part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with Beth's group tonight with you all is to, first of all, get a good hardcore look at what the fundamental rib cage is for how to make these networks work, and then have a real conversation about, well, is there anything some of it probably shouldn't and doesn't apply. Some of it maybe would be very wise to apply because the kind of issues, because humans ultimately at the bottom of a lot of this, and it's foreseeable we'll have disputes, and it's foreseeable that things will change over time, et cetera, et cetera. How could we express some of this in, Solidity or in other smart contract languages? So I'd say that's very much an open question right now. And I think the question you asked is the question that gave rise to this talk and that we want to talk about.
Well, thank you for that. And I will definitely listen to the rest of the talk. But I apologize, I do actually have a good. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing more.
Hopefully we'll be continuing to discuss and reference this.
Yes, I'll check out the link.
Yeah.
Any other feedback before I show the last one? Okay, hearing none. I'm just going to show you one more, and then let's talk about whatever you want to talk about. So here we go. Boom, da-dum, da-dum. Okay. So now here's one more I want to show. This is one that came thanks to some DARPA funding at MIT several years ago, back in 2012, I think it was. We had this system where they wanted to see if we could, how would we develop a personal data system, basically, so that vets, like returning from the wars, could have their own system for holding their personal health records and other personal data. So we prototyped some whiz-bang MIT technology for that, and it was very distributed with PDSs, or personal data stores. And this was a example of what we thought the rules base would be for that to operate. So again, maybe no surprises, but there's some business stuff, legal stuff, and technical stuff. Business stuff has, like, what is the scope? What I just said, personal data for individuals, and operating with like their care providers and others, friends and family, individual participants, system provider, like who's running the system, third-party providers, like maybe WebMD perhaps, or a clinic, or something like that. What are the now, something that I started doing around this time was having a section up in the business part where we actually identified what services were currently supported and provided in the system. So you can just sort of slot in new services and sunset old services. So for various reasons, we didn't go into detail about each of these services, but in this system, there was a personal data storage and archive service, kind of like, imagine a Dropbox, but that was more owned and controlled by you. There was a data collection and import service, so you could get all your stuff with something called Blue Button from the Veterans Administration and from doctors and other stuff. And that was a specific service with some standards and some metadata and kind of JSON and XML stuff for data structuring. There was a personal data sharing control service, which allowed for certain authorizations that the users could set. That was a service that was addressable at a REST interface. Analytics and visualization, so people could see stuff in their data, and they could use third-party apps and services to analyze and visualize their stuff. They could hook it up so long as they were standards compliant. How do you know what standards compliant? You could read section 1.2.4 for all that. And an export and deletion service. So that became way bigger, years later, with the European Union's right to be forgotten. So this ended up, you'll see it's the last one. It almost didn't make it in, but it ended up being very important. It was a recording, what are we keeping records of? Who gets to use the logo? It's the kind of business stuff. Legal stuff, who makes the rules? And it was basically like, the idea is it would be like a representative consortium, order of precedence, again, rights and obligations between the parties. It's handy to know. What are you supposed to be logging, and how do you do reporting? Liability, like I said, I promised, it's always a big part. How do you amend the things? How do you get notices when it really matters? Other stuff. And then the best part, technical stuff. So in this case, we're using OAuth 2. And so we sort of indicated the profile of OAuth 2 we were using to integrate external third-party apps and services and platforms, and what's authoritative and normative. These are like the absolutely official versions of the standards that we were applying.
Authoritative and normative?
Yeah. Do you see section 3.1.2.4?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we might have just called them normative, and we might have just called them authoritative, but and they're fundamentally synonyms, but some people that were involved used one word, other people used another word, and we all agreed that if we called it authoritative and normative, everybody knew what it meant. So literally, that's how this sausage was made.
Well, could you kind of explain the concept of that? Because I think I know what it is, but I think I feel like that's one of the most useful things for like extrapolating this to like a blockchain system, for example, is like, especially, in a context where, these systems are made by developers, usually not involving lawyers at all, then, how do you have a system that's like has normative rules, and when do those normative rules also convey like authority and, like within the system? And then for this question of how to like extrapolating that to smart contracts, like how is the authoritative power kind of conveyed like autonomously within the system? So yeah, I think going into authoritative and normative would be super helpful for kind of grounding this discussion in mechanism design.
Yeah, sure. So you'll notice that there's very little in section 3.1.2.4. We have the OAuth standard, the core standard, and for bearer tokens. And then in this case, we had JSON object signing and encryption. So like JWT tokens, JWS signing, JWE encryption, JWK keys in our algorithm. There's a lot of stuff that people would do that we didn't say was authoritative and normative. So for example, how are you doing CSS? Well, that matters for the apps. And, there's a lot of different things people did that they could sort of do their own way, and that we said was out of scope of what it meant to be able to be interoperable and to be basically like part of this network. But what was not negotiable were these two sets of standards, some OAuth 2 token stuff for authorization tokens, and basically the digital signature and signing stuff and the crypto stuff. And that was the result of discussion about what was core and fundamental to the network. And it was so core that there was really no argument that it needed to be in the rule set, and we needed to define what version of it we were going to all apply. And if people couldn't deal with that, then they shouldn't be in this network. And that's why we wrote it down.
Yeah. So how do you account for that changing, for example? Like if if the certain, a certain version of CSS, or like if you're referring to like a component library or like a pattern library for being, what is used within the system, what if that changes? How do you account for the ability for that change to happen and still be in accordance with, the way that the system's functioning?
Yeah. So up in the legal part, we have this section called amendment. The rules may be amended from time to time by the system provider in accordance with the notice requirements. So you'll notice that this is somewhat arbitrary, and partly, mind you, this particular system. Here, let me get off screen share. And you can all see the links yourselves. But this particular system was a pilot from a part of Department of Defense called DARPA. It was an advanced research project, and it was absolutely hierarchical. And so they just, you can think of it almost like Facebook or Dropbox or Google. They're going to provide it, but there was not any debate about it being a democracy. And so whoever provided the system would amend it, they'd give you notice, and that's that. So nothing really fun or even interesting there. In the insurance network, by contrast, if they wanted to change the standards, which has come up from time to time, then basically the way they worked it out was very interesting. So what made sense in that context was people across the industry that were involved actively in this network would join one of three working groups. One of the working groups was a technology working group. So it was people from the CIO or CTO's offices or the security offices from across the industry, no matter what stakeholder they were, insurance providers, brokers, vendors. They did the technology stuff. And when they all kind of agreed that we needed to change something in the rules for the technology, then they would vote on it basically. And then they would propose it to this little governance council we had, which was, had some representation from all the industry. And for the most part, the governance council would, ask everybody, does anyone object to this? If no one objected, then they would change the rules. And so it was very much bottom up, you could say. It was people in the technology working group or the legal working group from across the industry or the business working group wanted to change something. They would just propose what sections they would change. Something that was interesting that they had to do, by the way, in that case is a few months into it, they realized, you know what? When like the technology people are changing stuff, we're not really sure what the implications are. Like, do we need to change something legally, or is it change a business process? So they ended up doing this beautiful thing, which was called a harmonization committee. And I wish more industries and groups had that. And basically the chair, who was voted by across the business, legal, and technical groups, they all had a rotating chair. That person, the chair of the business group, the legal group, and the technology group had a 3-person harmonization committee. And whenever any of their groups wanted to change something, they'd just show it to the other people, and they'd scan down the stuff that, like, the business people really understood the business stuff, legal people understood the legal stuff, technology people understood the technology stuff, and they could just talk like 3 people and be like, oh, well, would that change our notice, or would this change the specification? And they could go back and forth, and sometimes they had to ask a clarifying question back of the group who didn't realize the implications, and they would work out what the changes should be. So usually a change in one section would actually cause a little nip or a tuck in one of the other sections. And then when so at the end of the day, they agreed that only changes that were recommended by the harmonization committee to the governance boards were the ones that went through, because whether we voted for or against it, at least we know we weren't going to break the whole thing if we changed one part of it. So I was surprised by how beautiful the insurance industry was to work with. They get a bad rap, but they know how to govern stuff. And at some point they decided, we're not competing on passwords. We need to make this interoperate and be invisible. We need to collaborate, even if we compete on the market. And so I'd say that they're a really good example of how to collaborate well and harmoniously. So if you were to do so, those are some examples of how you might change what the norms are that are authoritative within a system. If you had a little bit more formality and explicitness with the rules.
Yeah.
Usually norms, like true norms, are not written down at all. They're just kind of agreed socially and impliedly. They're more like customs almost. But when you use the word normative, it has a little bit more of an official flavor to it.
Yeah, I mean, and, you know, in terms of that being something that isn't usually written down, I think that's one of the core questions about how to translate these, you know, kind of emergent, like qualitative relationships into smart contracts, where it's like, you know, if you want a system that runs like autonomously or semi-autonomously with regards to governance, then you need to translate the sort of thing that aren't usually written down, you know, have a way of translating norms kind of throughout the system that is interoperable with the, you know, all of those three like BLT verticals. So I think that's one reason why this discussion is incredibly useful for mechanism design. Like, you know, so that will be incredibly useful. Hopefully, yeah, once you have understanding.
And so that's what I wanted to go over. I wanted to show you three kind of examples of what a umbrella rule set for a big network with a bunch of people that can't fire each other could look like. And how you could break things into business, legal, and technology buckets, and that can actually make it run a little bit smoother. And then not just break into business, legal, and technology buckets, but to have those three things be part of a single markdown document or a single file, so that everyone can see the whole thing, and having a unified glossary or unified definitions across them can make it easier to have true interoperability. Is not just a technical phenomenon. A lot of interoperability happens at the business level and the legal level too. So you kind of got to get all three of those cylinders firing in sync to have, you know, complete interoperability of systems, in my experience.
Yeah.
So let's open it up to everybody. I don't care if you don't want to talk about what I just said, but what does everyone want to talk about now?
I'll go ahead and ask a kind of straightforward question. So you mentioned the importance of having like some concept of being in or out of a network. In cases of like, trying to think of the best way to phrase it, like heterogeneous networks, where you may have, I can't think of a good concrete example, but let's say you've got a couple of bodies that are adhering to the same standards, but they are different networks.
Yeah.
I guess have you encountered any strategies for kind of reconciling that like situation where I've got linked networks and that in or out problem, you know, by one network's criteria, this actor is going to be out, by this network's criteria, it's going to be in.
Yeah, that's like my whole life, basically. Heterogeneous networks, but like they want to kind of interoperate when they want to, but no one wants to change what they do or how they do it. And it can be a challenge. So sometimes you can come up with like translators or adapters or, you know, things that will up level or do some sort of, you know, some sort of like some kind of like translator of some type, and that can work. Sometimes you know, there's different parts of an organization. Like this happens in libraries. Here's a good example of what I think exemplifies what you were referring to. So libraries are usually members of multiple different networks, and some of that has to do with just what they can interoperate with. So their card catalog might be one way. The way that they do kind of like you know, like reservations could be another way. The way they do events is a whole different way. The way they, you know, they've got these different systems of systems, and they have to be in different federations and networks to make it work. And usually it kind of clusters into people that really have a high value or priority to work together, and who have business like leadership that is willing to either change to basically use standards or approaches that maybe aren't their first choice, but achieve membership in the community they want to be kind of, operating within, or sometimes it ends up being that we've got, two different networks doing the same thing for no reason other than that they were locked into different, vendors or different standards or even different versions of standards sometimes. Like, I remember with RSS, like there were all these great podcasting networks that use one version of RSS. Then RSS, there was sort of a second version. Some of them used it, and that really broke a lot of, great things. The fact that the standard moved and some people didn't, and other people did, or they tried to use some other stuff. And RDF came along, and so I think what you're talking about is really at the cutting edge of the conversation of how do we get along, and what are we willing to do the same, and when do we draw the line because we don't want to do it that way.
And can you explain the significance of RDF coming along and impacting this? Because I think that's also a really important thing for people to understand with this discussion.
Okay. So who knows what RDF is? And there's show of hands. One. Oh, okay. So I guess this is good. So RDF is a standard that comes from MIT, actually, from CSAIL and the World Wide Web Consortium and Tim Berners-Lee specifically. And it basically has this way to sort of, it's structured data. So it's a data structure kind of standard, and it operates based on so-called triplets. So it's a way that you can sort of like connect three things together, like kind of, like a subject and an object and a verb or that kind of thing. And it makes perfect sense to a lot of people. They love it. It makes no sense to a whole bunch of people. They don't get it, and it seems somewhat arbitrary at some point. But if you use it, it gives you a little more flexibility and with what they call semantic web, so you can do more sophisticated and nuanced ways to relate different things. There's other people that use a standard which is just straight JSON. It's a notation language for structuring data that's more like almost like a markup language. So you can basically kind of like chunk parts of information, between tags almost. And so it doesn't have a sense of triplets. And so one example that I think is beautiful, and it comes up with DIDs, distributed identifiers in like the sovereign space and in some of the sovereign identity space, is people came up with this hybrid of the two, JSON LD, which is this kind of version of JSON that represents RDF like triplets in it. So they kind of like use the JSON syntax, but then they also kind of use this RDF concept, and they've found a way to sort of merge it. So at least on the surface, it still kind of looks like JSON, but it also kind of achieves the stuff that you want from RDF. In reality, it's RDF at the bottom of it. So like you still have to understand that and the logic of it to parse it and make an application do the right things. But that's a great example to the gentleman's question about what if people, like, how do you deal with different folk kind of having maybe different standards, and how do you make it interoperate? Well, there's a lot of people that wanted the RDF world and the JSON world to interoperate, like including people in the sovereign identity space, and people came up with like a new hybrid standard for it. That was one way they did it. More typically, people, it's kind of winners and losers, I'm sorry to say, where people are just like, well, do it this way or the highway. And that's unfortunate. The best thing is when you look at what you're actually trying to do, and then you select the standards, or you select parts of the standards that you're going to apply to the way your community wants to do it. Maybe I'm getting old now, but I kind of feel like the best, most important thing is human beings, as fascinating and wonderful as technology is. And I think like, if there's a bunch of people that want to have a relationship with each other and they want to be doing things together, I just feel if you're creative enough and intelligent enough and have enough endurance, you can find technology that can support and reflect the way people want to behave and want to interact, and build backwards from what people want and who wants to play with each other. But people should never be prevented from playing with each other because someone in a technology group said you can't. To me, that's a failure of the technology.
Yeah. And also, yeah, I don't know if this is getting too specific, but yeah, it would be really cool to kind of explain like the role of like why RDFs are useful for representing the semantic information in a way that's more, I don't know. Well, so this is getting like that. Oh, sorry, that's actually what I was doing with the question. So yeah.
I'm honestly kind of lost. Can we talk about how this can be applied specifically to blockchain and the mechanisms of trustlessness and maybe TCRs.
What's a TCR?
Sorry, token curated registry.
Oh, right. Yeah. I'm sorry. TCR has like 3 different meanings in my head. Okay, I gotcha. Yeah. Thank you. Totally got about that. Yeah.
That I think links those potentially. So
What?
I'm sorry, I have like kind of a directed question that like links those, I think. So, you know, we have the goal of like drawing back from this to like mechanism design and talking about how, you know, what we've been talking about here is like very specific examples of, you know, mechanisms that work and mechanisms that are working in a system and how those are codified and, you know, how they work on a technological perspective and these different things. And so I think, you know, it would be very useful to like, if you could kind of like draw back in terms of detail to say, you know, this is how linked networks or like why it is necessary for linked networks to be able to represent information in this way. And then, to get to your point of, you know, when we're designing mechanisms that are acting in the system, whether it's, you know, something like a TCR that like is trying to accomplish a certain goal, that goal would need to be able to be codified in these agreements, or whether it's, you know, a governance structure that doesn't necessarily involve, you know, explicit mechanisms for curating, but instead just, you know, mechanisms for behaving equally. Like, you know, why it was important to go into this detail, and also, you know, how for people who aren't thinking of it in such a technical way, like specifically how this applies and why that is like, you know, unique to blockchain specifically.
I think you made a great point that you're saying that we've been talking about how traditional networks are set up and how the participants in traditional networks can be added, governance around them be added, and some of the systems. So now we're talking about.
Could you move my little computer body closer to the speaker? I just want to hear every word you're saying. Thank you.
Sure. So it sounds like we've been talking about traditional networks and how actors can be added to them, what sort of governance rules can be set up. And so now kind of seems to make sense to talk about, well, how can we implement this in the blockchain world and develop trustless networks that accomplish the same and some.
Yeah, I agree. So can Beth, do you mind if I just pick it up from the speakers?
Oh yeah, sorry. She actually asked exactly what I was trying to kind of articulate, drawing it all together. So perfect.
So yeah. Here's a few thoughts on that. So one thought would be, I'm drawing a little bit from conversations with DAO Stack and with some other groups that are trying to do more flexible DAOs. You know, I don't know. Do you guys know Noah Thorpe? He's in San Francisco. Anyway, Noah Thorpe and Tony Lai is another one that's been working on a bit of a gap that seems to exist with blockchain-based systems, and it's specifically at that level of governance. And so it raises a question. So last time I was at Starfish Network was during San Francisco Blockchain Week, and we had this big event on governance and blockchain. And part of what we were talking about, which I think we're still talking about tonight, is what is in the gap? Like, what are the way I would say is functions of governance that you would want to have addressed and available in a blockchain, and how could you do it if you wanted to exist, for example, in a smart contract, if you wanted to have an attribute of trustlessness. These are kind of how-tos, but there's also a question of what would you do for governance. So some things that I would suggest are in the past have been helpful in governance are, one, to have a clear way to distinguish who's in and who shouldn't be in a network. So if you've got, for example, people that are, I don't know, fraud artists or trying to bring the system down, being able to distinguish an attack from from a healthy node is a great thing to do. And yet you don't want to draw that line wrong and cut out people that are not doing anything wrong. You don't want to draw the line wrong and have a bunch of people and bringing the network down. governance is a place where you can have a conversation about those kinds of standards. And the other thing is, how do you avoid like a dramatic, tear-filled hard fork? A hard fork that is the result that surprises everybody. One way to look at that is, well, could you have anticipated that there might be a desire to go different directions, or there might have been a way to come to a consensus on a future version and a roadmap that addresses everybody's concerns through governance? Like, could there be something, some method, mechanism, process that you could identify within your system that would enable a kind of progressive and a graceful evolution of the system, as opposed to an unexpected, dramatic, mostly offline hard fork? This would be another feature or function of governance, I would say. So that's how I would kind of look at what could potentially be learned from the past. What you don't probably want to do is, in the past, people had meetings, you know, so that it'd be a certain number of people on a committee. It was bureaucratic, and they would have a vote, and they would vote on the next version. But is there a way you could do that in a way that's programmatic and automated? So it's a result of the activity on a system, or it was crowdsourced, or in other ways could utilize the system itself to internalize what the evolution of future versions of the system would be. But anyway, these are some of the features, or the best of functions of governance of multiplayer networks of the past. And some of them could be on a to-do list for architects of DAOs that are looking for functions to achieve through autonomous automated methods. So that's kind of how I look at the connection that I think you're asking about.
Yeah, and do you think that there could be a token component also? Because that is really what differentiates a blockchain system from any other system. It's just the token as the business model.
Yeah, I don't see why you couldn't. Like, if people in the past that had paid me in the private sector to create these systems, it said, Daza, we don't want to have meetings. We don't want to have like a harmonization committee, and we don't want to have that, and we don't want to have Microsoft Word export as PDF as the rules. Rather, we want it expressed in solidity, and we want people not to have a vote on a committee and a spreadsheet, but we want a token to represent how people have a say and how we update other parts of the network. I think it would be possible to come up with that. I think if you set as a constraint for developing and architecting the processes and systems of governance that you want to effectuate it through tokens, and you came up with tokens that represented proposals, as you do. I mean, that's an old thing now, and maybe types of proposals that change the system rules versus proposals that are a transaction within the system, and set, you know, new kinds of barriers like they do in DAO Stack for super majorities for big rules. And you could even do things like tokens that represent that someone has accurately performed a formal verification of a proposal, and that creates a kind of token, and you need that token with the other voting tokens before something goes on a roadmap. I do think it's possible to do things with tokens. I don't think anyone's done it yet, and not to this level of sophistication, though.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's possible, and I'm a product manager, so I'm always asking the question of why. Does it make sense? And I'm not sure anyone has yet answered the why do you need a token in this kind of system.
Why you need a token?
Yeah, I mean it's possible, but why?
Oh, well, I think I mentioned this at the start. Nobody has ever paid me money and said, you need to use a token. It's never been the most efficient or effective way to just get their network doing the transactions they want. But if somebody felt there was a business need and a priority, I think you could use a token. I, to this day, have not heard a business case for doing that. But people keep swearing. People I respect tell me that there's something worth it. Like Tony Lai, I respect him a lot. And he really believes, and same with this guy, Noah Thorpe, who you should meet in San Francisco. They think that there's something about this token economy that's worth exploring. So that's partly why we're talking about it. I myself have not yet seen that light.
I do, because actually what he just described is like what I'm building. So it's like building a TCR system for one of these DAO companies to basically as a method of enacting governance. So that was kind of the basis of this discussion, like, you know, saying what is, like in terms of like architecting a DAO system that is able to like enact governance in this way. And for us, like, we're still at the beginning of kind of developing, this token mechanism, but the primary function is like from using a token as a way of abstracting something, abstracting and then like creating functionally like something like reputation. So if you want to be able to have like a variable in the system that goes with, so it's like we had talked about how like, identity is like really important, like variable to describe for how like these objectives are actually achieved. It's like, how do you have identity serve in a functional way for kind of figuring out, who is able to, put these rules forward, who's able to define the rules, who, enact, is able to like enact and enforce the rules, who's able to change them and when. And, there's not a
system.
Like, so it's
Decentralized?
Yeah, so it's completely decentralized. Well, not completely. It's decentralized in a certain way, and so it's like, in order to figure out who it is that's able to do those things in a decentralized system, then you have to be able to have like reputation and or competence or whatever it is. It's just reputation is the I guess function that's often used, and it's like the kind of token that is like earnable right now. So it's like, how do you define competence, et cetera, and how do you like accumulate that in such a way that it sets parameters? Like that's why we are using it. So in that system, it is reputation. Sorry. I can't like super talk about it yet, but in a few weeks. Yeah.
So can I ask, is there, I see there's a few other people around the table. You're under no obligation to speak, and I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but does anyone else have any thoughts or reflections or, yeah.
So like for decentralized governance, like
could you move my little computer body close to the speaker? Sorry.
Yeah, so I think like the identity problem is the crucial problem first to solve for decentralized governance. Because, for example, if you just take governance by tokens, right? Say like everybody in the system is voting for a particular decision, whether to go left or right. So you can't just do that with tokens, because then there's going to be a form of civil attacks where the person with the highest stake is going to be able to choose the direction of the path. So you kind of need an identity where like a single person is not voting twice, no matter how much stake he has. And until that thing is not solved, it's going to be pretty difficult to like have mechanisms to really operate, make it more complex to really govern the system.
Yeah. So on that, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What if? So I've been talking to a number of people since 2016 specifically on how best to distinguish at population scale whether an entity on a network is a human being or a non-human entity, like software or a bot of some type. And so here's the question: what do you think of the idea of using an existing capability that we have in every country, that's widely deployed and accessible pretty much to almost every person, other than very, very rural areas, and that's a notary. So in the US, you can go, there's plenty of notaries that are a little bit more of a trusted role. They have a license from the government, and they watch a person sign something, and they notarize that they saw this human sign it. That's not so different from watching a person do something on a keyboard, for example. In fact, a lot of notaries now are electronic or digital signature notarizations. Do you think it could be possible to address the issue you're just describing by utilizing like a new class of players, which are human notaries that are government licensed to authenticate the fact that the entity that utilized that token was in fact an individual human being?
Yeah, so I think like it's more on the onboarding aspect, right? Like taking a human being and putting him in somehow like electronic form, right? So we can always have like this on ramps, right? Like for example, you have trusted entities across the globe who are basically onboarding a human being to a particular key or particular identification on the blockchain, right? Once that thing is onboarded, you're pretty sure that like this is a legit account. And the way you can do is that you can have certain like insurance model or something where, for example, I'm the entity who's onboarding a lot of people. I stake some of my money on the chain or somewhere. and I basically do background check or something for that particular human being. And if he does something bad on the chain anytime, I lose certain stakes. So it's the entity who is doing that is responsible. So it's basically like, would you let this guy drive your car or not, right? You can, depending upon what kind of governance system is entering, there can be multiple checks. And you can have certain kind of staking model where I can, as a business, charge him for getting him on the particular model, but as well, I'm staking something to make sure that I put the right persons on the governance model.
Yeah, so you have a vouching and accountability for the vouching.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. So I think you may have answered your own question there. For what it's worth.
But yeah, it's kind of difficult, right? Since we don't have that system right now, like placed where you can really have that solve that thing. But I think once that's solved, like you can do awesome stuff like quadratic voting and everything with governance. And I think that would be the crucial part. Once that's done, then we're gonna see really good mechanisms. And the other thing I also think is that, like,
before you go to the other thing, just one comment on the last thing is the life cycle moment you were describing is in identity management, what we call enrollment. You know, like, or you said onboarding is pretty good, and you know, enrolling and validation that the person, you know, should have a card or should have a this or a whatever, a connection. But you know, there's a lot of ways after people are onboarded to then proxy off, or for them to zombie their machine or other things to aggregate it. So I do think there's a lingering thing that's going to come back and bite us in, you know, 2020 and 2022 and in the future more and more, when we still have these non-human actors that are aggregating things, maybe without the knowledge or consent of whoever vouched for them in the first place, and maybe even without their knowledge or consent because they downloaded the wrong email or something. And having some continuous way to monitor just that someone is human and alive, I have a feeling is going to also be important. I just want to say that. But what's the next thing?
Yeah, I just forgot.
I'm sorry.
I had a question.
Oh, wait, sorry. Let me just say something
Yeah.
quickly. I think what you just said is an important answer to this question of how blockchain comes in. It's like blockchain's ability to verify and blockchain's ability to make it so once the identity is verified and, you know, like number one, that it enables like the identification, you know, in a discrete scenario, but also over time so that you can know, you know, that the same actor is, you know, being the actor in the system over time. And once you verify that they are a human or that they are the right person that is supposed to be doing that, you can continue knowing it's the right person. And then the other thing too is that then once that's able to be done, then you can have these quadratic voting mechanisms or whatever you were describing. And so it's like, it both enables, you know, the like foundation of the system to be laid and then like the rules of the system to kind of float around within it. I would love, yeah, if you could explain a little further about like why, you know, how blockchain factors into y'all's choices for all of that, because I think that could be very illuminating.
Yeah, even like I just remember the other thing as well.
Good.
So I think like this is like a very naive opinion, but I think like the governance, even if you start with like more democratic, it's in the end it's gonna still like converge towards a small committee voting on the decision. And I think people are gonna decide who, like the committee could be big, like 12 people, 20 people, 30 people, but then people, like a system with like, let's say 2 million people are gonna stake their vote on somebody else voting for them, basically. So you're gonna have a small committee, but like the entire ecosystem is gonna vote for the person who think they wanna latch on, because every decision cannot be like, I cannot make a decision for like a technical reason for like governance of a particular system, right? Because I'm not educated enough. But I might stake my vote on somebody I think would make the right decision.
Yep.
And it's like in the end, it's gonna still converge to a small committee of people. That's what I'm guessing. Yeah, but
that's a well taken point. When I was much younger, I had ran for office and was elected to a local government. And something I did very frequently, because I was, you know, just my early 20s, is I would look to people that I had a relationship with and who I respected for certain like budget items. And some people really understood infrastructure like sewage and roads. And I couldn't necessarily evaluate all the information I was getting on whether we should do a 30-year bond and this and that or not. And I would just ask them, and I would sometimes literally just look to see, well, how are they voting? And if they stick their hands up, I'd stick my hand up. And if they didn't, I wouldn't. And it would be different people for different things, actually. Like education, I'd look at other people. And sometimes I would have my own opinion. Sometimes I just, I don't know, just got kind of like whatever, uppity and just did whatever I felt like doing. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad social outcome for people to look at those that they trust and to proxy their votes. There's a whole big system in Google now that where they're perfecting very scalable ways to vector your trust, in a sense, and vector your votes to people that you think can do a better, that you want to represent. You want a topic by topic kind of thing, and then to be able to, at a moment, change that to other people, so that you're always sort of accountable and it's always transparent. And but that it allows for the social function of people, congregating in factions or parties or voting blocks and that kind of thing. And I do think there's something very human about it, and it's not necessarily bad.
And it would also be like kind of critical to just examine how like big enterprises over here, let's say Google, Facebook, or all those big enterprises, which are not run by a particular single entity, right, a single person, how they make their critical decisions, right, how their company is going to progress and how they come to a conclusion or a consensus about what decision next stage it should make, right? So that kind of model could also be somehow taken, like you can take inspiration from that kind of model to basically try to bring it to like other systems as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. Some of the best stuff I've done, I've stolen from Google, because like they've got a lot of people thinking about a lot of interesting things, and some of the stuff they're doing should, for civic purposes, should not operate under a single oligopoly like Google, but we should do it in open public networks. And I think a lot of what they do is open source, and it's very translatable. And if I understood your question correctly, I think it's a good idea to take good ideas from wherever they come and try to avoid patents when you can, and to reuse and extend them.
Yeah, I was more about like how people inside Google, right, the board member or whoever is leading Google, basically try to manage their problems or their critical decisions, right? Because that is also like a big governance system, which like there is no like a single guy not deciding like who's or what decision to make in the particular enterprise.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot with Google people now. That are you familiar with the walkout that they did? There's like 20% of the Google workforce walked out in protest over like a golden parachute for like some disgraced executive, and then they did some other stuff with respect to their disagreement with their military contract and some other things for the Dragonfly project with India and censorship. They're organizing now very much inside Google in a non-hierarchical way that's peer-to-peer on these interesting dark nets and encrypted little forums, things like that. So there's a lot of lessons we can learn from how people are self-organizing at Google, and not just the official ways either. Okay, who else has any questions or ideas?
Is there information about this online?
Could you move my robot eyes?
Yeah. I think you want to ask your question, right?
I'm just asking you for like information about that anywhere online. About what you were just talking about Google? Because you said some of what they're doing is open source.
Oh, yeah, I was like, many Google projects are open source, and they're actually on GitHub, and you can fork them. Not everything.
Specifically about the voting system, just as like
what's that?
About the vectored voting and like what you're talking about with the employees.
Oh yeah. So Beth, can you send me a follow-up by email or Telegram, so I can go back and find that proxy was the word they used, proxy voting scale. I'll find that and I'll send it to Beth, and or I'll do it on the Telegram group for mechanism design, and I'll share what I have on that. As I recall, the person published a paper, and some of the code was out there, and it was still a little bit iffy, like a year ago last time I checked in on it. But I would love to share that. I thought it was actually very promising.
Cool. That sounds really awesome. Okay, so sorry about the light.
I read a hey, Daz, Anthony here. Hey, what's going on?
Hi.
So I read a book, I believe last year, by Tim O'Reilly called WTF, What's the Future? And in it he talks a lot about artificial intelligence and looking at, yes, we are humans and we do make illogical choices. Is there a way, I'm curious to know your opinion, how do we integrate data analysis, data science, artificial intelligence to help us improve our governance performance, both at the micro level, but also reverberating beyond the little microcosm? Because
can you back up a few words? I sort of spaced out or something. It was, how do we do what?
Yeah. How do we use artificial intelligence to optimize our governance structures? Because we are, we do get locked into kind of our self-fulfilling prophecies, and we may miss things because of ego or just, limited sight. So how do we integrate artificial intelligence to maybe get a bigger picture, not just on our small microcosm, but is there a way to compare our little bubble to another little bubble and within the bigger bubble?
What a great question. Thank you for asking that. So I know I can share. So first of all, I think the answer is yes, that's possible. And the way to achieve it is by continuously asking the question, but let me give you an example of how I've seen it achieved. In the research lab where I'm a scientist, it's called Human Dynamics Lab. And, oh, do you know it?
Oh, no,
Oh, okay.
Move your eyeballs around.
I felt like I was on like a hovercraft there for a minute. But anyway, so the Human Dynamics Lab did a very interesting, what we call computational social science research project with a European trading exchange system. And I'm blanking on the name of it now. I can send you the site later. It's written about in this book called Social Physics. Where you can learn more about it. But basically the issue that they were having was that in this trading network, well, first of all, a function that it provided was what they call social trading or something like that, and you could basically stake a sum of your holdings within the network to just do whatever trades someone does. So it's almost sort of like an index, but it's like if you're watching how other people are performing, and even if you don't understand how they're making their decisions, you just like what they're doing, you can be like, well, 15% of my holdings just do whatever that user does. And so one of the things that happened is that it was subject, like every market is subject to these bubbles. And so there'd be these times when people would be sort of following the leader, and they'd also be getting certain information, like all trading systems to give you like analyst reports and news items and things like that. And there would be this like bubble, and it would bust. And this is not very efficient for a market. Like a little volatility is fine, but bubbles and busts we reserve for market malfunction. And so basically, what this group did, in collaboration with the trading system and in accordance with the rules, was they did deep data science on what were the characteristics when one of these bubbles was forming. And one of the things we could say in colloquially was it was like an echo chamber. So it was like enough of people that other people watched were sort of listening to each other, and they kind of worked themselves into this frenzy, and then there'd be a bust. So you could call it artificial intelligence for sure, but using various model-driven, kind of data science methods that are all cited in the papers that you can read, they were able to identify when one of these bubbles seemed to be forming. So before it formed, and then they would actually give the people in that sphere and like one penumbra outside of it, I think, different information. It's just like, well, just start listening to other parts of the network and get more of a rational, more like a statistical norm of what's happening in your marketplace. And they were able to, very effectively reduce the number of these bubbles and busts way below what would have been expected in trading periods. So that's one example where they realized they had an issue. They worked with some data scientists to, in a sort of programmatic way, break these cycles that were really the result of somewhat human foibles, but also a little bit of systems design, so that instead of like having a rule or a meeting, the system literally would programmatically change some of the communications or messages and make it more representative to avoid the echo chamber. That would be one, kind of very literal example of a way that I know it's possible. But in general, what I'd say is what you said, I think, is the high promise of artificial intelligence and data science, is make it so that we can get almost like a God's eye view on a system and not be so subject to the foibles and faults of irrational of what we do as individuals and in herd mentality.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up with that to connect to what, so what you just described is exactly what I was hoping to get at with the question about like normative versus authoritative rules. So there's this idea that I'm putting forward with some people called like algorithmic governance. That's basically, kind of taking the idea that you just described and saying, here is the, you know, and like from algorithms determining like what the emergent rules and structures are that, you know, kind of end up being authoritative rules, or, you know, identifying what the normative rules and normative interactions are within this governance system. And then, you know, because they are representative programmatically, then they're able to become, you know, the authoritative rules for the system if they, you know, are emergent enough. So, you know, if that would be interesting to talk about to people, I would love to kind of hear your thought of the connection between those two things.
Yeah, well, I think the way you described it when we were saying, why don't we do a session together, I think was going from like code to prose, and from prose to like parameters and data-driven processes.
Well, kind of, but more what I was saying with that was, and what we were saying about an RDF triple, which is how those things all loop together. It wasn't a like linear process as much as like a tuple that includes all three of those things as being a way for the emergent structure to be defined. So
for sure. I think the trick with all this stuff is to, you know, do some math and do some thinking and theoretical work and some design work. But there's nothing better than to, you know, there's nothing to it but to do it sometimes. And, you know, being able to find existing systems like this research team did with the existing trade network, and try some of the data science approaches and measure very carefully what the results were to see if it was, you know, safe and effective, and then to see if it made sense to deploy in production, and then to build more systemically in. That's one way to do it. And another way to do it, obviously, is to build a brand new system that just supports and reflects this algorithmic governance and see how it works. I mean, one trick is getting enough people, so it's, you know, valid sample, and having something that's, you know, worth them actually doing, as opposed to, you know, paying them to be like a research puppet or something. And then the other thing is to another trick is sometimes people that kind of know how to break the system just wait until it gets big enough and there's enough honey in the pot for them to go and bust it. So having a lot of people that are there in a scientific, you know, lawful way, but whose whole job is just to break your system. You know, do every dirty trick, every penetration test, everything they can think of, because, you know, that will certainly happen naturally later anyway.
Yeah, totally. And yeah.
Well, so are we kind of at the witching hour now?
Yeah, so I would just love, if anyone else has like a final question, or just would like some clarification of how all these things relate back into blockchain and mechanism design specifically, I would definitely want to make sure that it's like really clear to everyone that everything that we are talking about is grounded in mechanism design and explicitly uses blockchain. So if anyone still like, provide some information, or
I have a little more time if people have more questions to clarify or more ideas or comments. This is a perfect time to do it. Wait, could you move my robot ears closer to the speaker?
So this is just kind of more of a brief comment to follow up on the what we kind of framed as like an identification problem. There's an argument that I've seen a few times which kind of sank in for me now, and I'll kind of phrase it in the terms that we've been using. So we said there's a network and there's going to be some rules for who's in and who's out. If you've designed the rules for who's in and who's out in a way that is like, okay, I can be confident that someone obeying these rules is going to, you know, achieve the goals that I want within this network, then at that point you shouldn't care if that actor is a human or a robot or a consortium of humans, because they're behaving according to the rules you designed. So I think that's a way to kind of design out that identification problem, because you're right, it's like you're not going to be confident that this address is really a human or
What was that? Was it Neil Stephenson? Didn't somebody write a book not like 10 or 15 years ago on, was it Anathema or something? Or anyway, someone wrote this interesting, you know, medium future book where there's all these like, you know, where the existing states, government states have, you know, long since passed, and, you know, it's become more like a combination of franchises and warlords and whatever. And, you know, half of the most effective ones were definitely not human. Like they were combinations of AIs and things. And I think we could definitely postulate that. For most of the systems that I do, nobody cares if you're human or not. They're either financial systems or or their kind of research systems, and whoever's performing is fine. And honestly, most of the ones that are humans and corporations, most of the activities happening in these either high and algorithmically anyway. Sometimes I do think it is important to have humans, until for example, in for purposes of, and this may not be an issue for some of you, but for purposes of a post-enlightenment public sector government, I think consent of governed is important. And I think it's for the foreseeable future, I would want to know who are the human beings that have consented to be governed for the validity and the health of the social compact. I think if we get to the point in the not foreseeable future where some entities are not carbon based and not but they're silicon based, and we grant them citizenship, then that would no longer be an issue. But until that happens, I do think for things like voting and public opinion about do we go to war or not, and who's the president and that kind of thing. In that case, that's where I was more speaking to in terms of knowing when you have a human, because we're subject to exploitation and being hacked, basically. Otherwise, it's not that we have this well-behaving AI, it's that in fact they're there to ruin everything. So we can't have nice stuff anymore. So that's under my kind of high-level musings on what you said. But in general, I'm kind of with you. If you have software do things better, I would take care of most of my legal things. Even when I used to practice law, the best stuff I did was the result of scripts that I wrote that were very not error prone, and everything was formatted correctly, and it wasn't me at late night making some dumbass error or kind of format issue. I feel like computers are great at doing a lot of the stuff that people currently do in commerce, and they should be treated as but there's still some certifications there. So what you said about well behaved and performing according to the rules, it's sort of I think we'd have to still have a conversation about what does that mean for algorithms, and should we be able, how do you audit algorithms that are black box or proprietary, and how can you reproduce something or be able to explain why it came up with a certain answer, to know whether it is or isn't complying with a rule, or whether it will have some anomalous kind of output later that will ruin everything in the perfect storm combination. So I think
output too.
What's that?
Humans have that kind of output too.
Yeah, I know we do. Yeah, so in some sense, I don't know, I guess I appreciate your point of view and I share it mostly. But to the extent that we've premised everything on it being human beings that are acting, at that point, I do think it's critical to distinguish whether it's a human acting or not, or whether it's like a giant bot army that's been, purchased like a mercenary to disrupt something.
Yeah, I wonder too if there is a governance model that can be created to help with demilitarization and denuclearization, because I feel that a lot of the problems surrounding World War III scenarios is nobody wants to back down, and there's no drawdown method of pre-prescribed. I just feel like the current system hasn't produced the results that we wanted to, and I wonder if blockchain offers a solution to having that transparent, drawdown.
Yeah, it could. I mean, I could imagine something where strategic defense systems of major powers had a fail-safe where when things were heating up according to some objective criteria, we basically got a timeout from the blockchain, to cool our jets, and doesn't matter how many people do the keys at the same time, we're not launching. We've basically suspended launch mechanisms. I think that one of the first issues I'm thinking about there is, well, that would be the very first system I would hack on my adversary if I wanted to pound them, and to put them in suspension, but not me.
Right.
But yeah, I think it would be nice if we could have cooler heads prevail, and frequently the coolest head is made of silicon.
The heat sink.
Right, with a good fan. Okay, well, I think I'm just about out of time, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
This was awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Incredibly useful. Bye.
Bye now.